Jane Goodall, living among chimpanzees. What would you do if you were alone in the African wilderness, surrounded by wild chimpanzees, with no laboratory, no expensive equipment, and no guarantee that they would ever accept you? Most people would keep their distance. Jane Goodall did the opposite. She walked toward them. In the green forests of Tanzania, where morning mist drifted between ancient trees and the calls of wild animals echoed through the valleys, a young woman sat quietly on the ground and watched. She had no idea that one of the chimpanzees would soon change her understanding of animals forever. And she had no idea that her decision to enter that forest would eventually change the way millions of people thought about our closest living relatives. It was 1960. Jane Goodall was only 26 years old. She had no university degree in biology. She had never conducted a major scientific study. And yet, she had come to Gombe National Park with a dream that many people considered unrealistic. She wanted to study chimpanzees. Not from behind a fence. Not from a laboratory. She wanted to observe them in their natural environment. She wanted to know how they lived. What they ate. How they communicated. How they raised their young. And perhaps most importantly, she wanted to understand how much of their behavior was truly different from ours. The journey that brought her there had begun years earlier, far away from Africa. Jane was born in London in 1934. As a child, she was fascinated by animals. While other children might have dreamed about becoming actresses, pilots, or famous explorers, Jane imagined herself living among animals in Africa. She loved books about the natural world. One book in particular captured her imagination, stories of Africa filled with wild animals, forests, and unexplored landscapes. She began dreaming of going there herself. It was not a practical dream. Her family did not have much money. And in the world Jane grew up in, scientific careers were still heavily dominated by men. But Jane had something more powerful than money. She had persistence. After leaving school, she worked various jobs and saved money until she could finally travel to Kenya to visit a friend. Africa was everything she had imagined. The landscape, the animals, the smell of the earth, the enormous sky. And during her time there, Jane met the famous paleontologist and anthropologist Louis Leakey. That meeting would transform her life. Leakey was searching for someone who could study chimpanzees in the wild. He believed that understanding chimpanzee behavior could help scientists better understand the evolutionary history of humans. When he met Jane, he noticed something unusual. She lacked formal scientific training, but she possessed patience, determination, and an extraordinary ability to observe. Leakey offered her an opportunity. Study chimpanzees. Jane accepted. And in 1960, she traveled to what is now Tanzania and established her research at Gombe. But the beginning was anything but easy. The chimpanzees did not welcome her. They were wild animals. They did not know who she was. When Jane approached them, they disappeared. She would spend hours walking through the forest, searching for signs of chimpanzees. Sometimes she saw them only for a few seconds before they vanished into the trees. Day after day, she followed. And day after day, they escaped. But Jane refused to give up. She learned that chasing them was useless. So she changed her strategy. She became still. She waited. Instead of forcing herself into their world, she allowed them to become accustomed to her presence. Slowly, something extraordinary happened. The chimpanzees stopped running. One particular chimpanzee became especially important. Jane called him David Greybeard. He was an older male with a distinctive gray beard. David began allowing Jane to observe him from relatively close range. And one day, Jane saw something that would rewrite the scientific understanding of chimpanzees. David was using a tool. He had taken a long piece of grass and inserted it into a termite mound. Then he pulled it out. Termites clung to the grass. David ate them. Jane watched in amazement. At the time, many scientists believed that deliberate tool use was a defining characteristic of humans. Tools belong to us. Animals might use objects accidentally, but sophisticated tool making and tool use were thought to separate humans from other animals. But here was a chimpanzee deliberately modifying an object and using it to obtain food. Jane immediately understood the importance of what she had witnessed. Chimpanzees were not simply reacting to the environment. They were manipulating it. They were solving problems. They were using intelligence. When Jane reported her observations, the scientific community took notice. Louis Leakey famously recognized the significance of the discovery. If chimpanzees could make and use tools, then perhaps the traditional boundary between humans and other animals was not as clear as scientists had believed. But that was only the beginning. Jane continued observing the chimpanzees. And the longer she stayed, the more human-like their social world appeared. She discovered complex relationships, friendships, conflicts, competition, cooperation, mother-child bonds, aggression, affection, dominance, and grief. She learned that chimpanzees were not simply individuals moving randomly through the forest. They lived in complicated communities. They recognized one another. They remembered relationships. They formed alliances. They communicated through gestures, sounds, facial expressions, and body language. And their lives were deeply connected. One of the most important parts of Jane's work was her decision to give the chimpanzees names rather than numbers. This was controversial. Traditional scientific research often treated animals as subjects identified by numbers. Jane saw individuals. David Greybeard, Flo, Fifi, and many others. To Jane, a chimpanzee was not simply subject 17. It was an individual with a personality and a history. Some were confident. Some were nervous. Some were aggressive. Some were gentle. Some were curious. And some seemed almost playful. This approach helped the world see chimpanzees differently. But life in the forest was not always beautiful. Jane witnessed violence. Male chimpanzees fought for dominance. Communities sometimes attacked neighboring groups. Infants could be vulnerable. And the struggle for survival was always present. She learned that nature was both beautiful and brutal. Perhaps the most emotionally powerful part of her observations involved mothers and their young. Chimpanzee mothers were deeply protective. Young chimpanzees spent years learning from them. They watched. They copied. They practiced. They made mistakes. And gradually, they learned how to survive. Jane began to understand that chimpanzee behavior was not simply instinct. Much of it was learned. A young chimpanzee had to discover how to find food, communicate, interact socially, and navigate the complicated rules of the community. In other words, chimpanzees had culture. Different communities could develop different behaviors. Knowledge could be passed from one generation to another. That idea challenged the old assumption that culture belonged exclusively to humans. The forest had become Jane's classroom. Every day brought another lesson. But the world beyond Gombe was changing too. Jane's research attracted international attention. Her photographs appeared in magazines. Her discoveries reached people who had never heard of Gombe. Suddenly, a young woman sitting quietly among chimpanzees had become one of the world's most recognizable scientists. Yet Jane did not see herself as a celebrity. She saw herself as an observer. Someone who had been given the extraordinary privilege of watching another species live its life. Her work also changed scientific education. Although she eventually earned a doctorate from the University of Cambridge, her path into science had been unusual. She had entered the field through observation rather than traditional academic training. And she proved that careful attention, patience, and curiosity could reveal things that sophisticated equipment might miss. But perhaps the greatest challenge was still ahead. The more Jane learned about chimpanzees, the more she realized that their future was connected to ours. Chimpanzees were losing habitat. Forests were being destroyed. Animals were being hunted. Human population growth and economic development were putting enormous pressure on ecosystems. Jane could have remained in the world of scientific research. Instead, she began speaking publicly. She became an advocate. She traveled around the world. She spoke to governments, scientists, students, communities, and ordinary people. Her message was simple but powerful. If we understand animals, perhaps we will care about them. And if we care about them, perhaps we will protect them. In 1977, she established the Jane Goodall Institute, expanding efforts to support chimpanzee research, conservation, and community-centered environmental work. Her work also increasingly focused on young people. She understood that protecting the future required more than studying the problems of today. It required inspiring the people who would inherit the planet tomorrow. Programs such as Roots and Shoots encouraged young people to take action for animals, people, and the environment. Jane's message was never simply about chimpanzees. It was about hope. She believed that individual choices could create larger changes. That even small actions mattered. That people should not become paralyzed by the size of environmental problems. And that young people, especially, should be encouraged to believe they could make a difference. But Jane's journey was not without personal loss. The forest she had known changed over time. Chimpanzee populations faced enormous pressures. Some of the animals she had known for years died. And the landscape itself reminded her that nothing in nature remains unchanged forever. Yet Jane continued. She traveled. She lectured. She wrote books. She met presidents and scientists. She spoke to school children. She visited communities living alongside forests. And everywhere she went, she carried the same lesson she had learned at Gombe. We are not separate from nature. We are part of it. That idea may sound simple today. But when Jane began her work, the relationship between humans and other animals was understood very differently. Her research helped demonstrate just how close chimpanzees are to humans. We share a remarkable amount of genetic similarity. We share aspects of social behavior. We share emotional responses. We form relationships. We care for our young. We experience conflict. We cooperate. And we learn from one another. The boundary between human and animal became more complicated. And perhaps that was Jane's most profound discovery. She did not merely teach us about chimpanzees. She taught us something about ourselves. Imagine returning to Gombe for a moment. The sun is rising. Mist hangs above the trees. Birds call from the canopy. Leaves move gently in the morning wind. Somewhere in the distance, a chimpanzee calls. Decades earlier, a young woman heard those same sounds. She had entered the forest carrying little more than notebooks, determination, and a dream. She did not know whether the chimpanzees would accept her. She did not know what she would discover. She certainly did not know that her observations would influence generations of scientists. But she kept watching. And because she watched, the world learned. It learned that chimpanzees could use tools. It learned that they possessed complex social lives. It learned that behavior could be passed between generations. It learned that animals were individuals, not machines. And it learned that humans were not as separate from the natural world as we sometimes imagined. Jane Goodall's story is therefore not simply a story about a woman who lived among chimpanzees. It is a story about curiosity. About walking into the unknown without knowing exactly what you will find. It is about patience when the answer does not appear immediately. It is about listening before speaking. Watching before judging. and understanding before deciding. Most importantly, it is a story about connection. Today, Jane Goodall continues to speak about conservation, animal welfare, and the future of our planet. Her work has inspired generations of researchers and environmental activists. But perhaps her greatest legacy can be found in the people who hear her story and begin looking at nature differently. A child who watches a bird outside a window. A student who becomes curious about animals. A researcher who spends years studying a species nobody else understands. A community that decides to protect a forest instead of destroying it. A person who realizes that protecting nature is not somebody else's responsibility. It is ours. And perhaps that is why the story of Jane Goodall remains so powerful. She did not begin with a giant laboratory. She did not begin with a prestigious scientific title. She began with a childhood dream. She followed that dream into the forest. Then she sat down. She waited. And she watched. What she discovered was astonishing. The chimpanzees were intelligent. They were emotional. They were social. They were capable of learning. They had personalities. They had relationships. They had lives. And the more Jane understood them, the more clearly she saw the connection between their world and ours. There is a beautiful irony in her story. Jane entered the forest hoping to understand chimpanzees. But in the end, the chimpanzees helped her understand humanity. They showed us that intelligence is not unique to one species. That emotion does not belong exclusively to humans. That communication can take many forms. That families matter. That communities matter. And that the natural world is far more complex than we once believed. The forest had given Jane a question. She spent her life helping the world discover the answer. And somewhere beneath the ancient trees of Gombe, chimpanzees still move through the branches, searching for food, caring for their young, communicating with one another, and continuing a story that began long before humans ever arrived. Jane Goodall simply became one of the rare people willing to sit quietly enough to listen. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Sometimes, changing the world does not begin with shouting. Sometimes it begins with silence. With patience. With curiosity. With one person sitting beneath the trees, watching another species live. And asking the simplest question of all. What can they teach us?